Hi everyone, and welcome to our channel Rack to Run, where we discuss with industry leaders issues around AI infrastructure and data centers. Joining us today is Reece Hayden from ABI Research. So Reece, thank you very much for your time and joining us today.
Lovely to meet you, and yeah, great to join you.
Great. So Reece, today we will talk about Neoclouds and the role that these companies are playing in the AI infra field. So Reece, how would you define Neoclouds and how do they differ from traditional hyperscalers?
So, kind of neoclouds at their core are really just infrastructure, AI infrastructure provision, and it's really about providing GPUs in the most effective way in purpose-built architecture to enterprises, AI ISVs, AI vendors, and when they kind of the provision is not determined on a business model or consumption model, but can be across a range of different areas. So you've got bare metal consumption where you're renting servers or GPU capacity. You've got co-location providers where all the neocloud is providing is the infrastructure, the servers, the racks to enable the cooling, all of the different factors you need to deploy and implement GPUs into data centers. When you kind of compare them across to from hyperscalers, there's significant differences, but obviously a lot of similarities. Obviously, both are around infrastructure provision. But at the moment, neoclouds are really focusing on just that, just the infrastructure, not the managed services, not the software, not the kind of surrounding ecosystem. Of course, there are kind of versions of AI neoclouds who are providing those, climbing up the stack, as we say, and moving towards software and managed services. But the bulk of the market is really in just GPU provision. In terms of the major differences, it's really about what the infrastructure looks like. There's a lot of people who would call hyperscalers CPU clouds. They're really focused on CPU provision, whereas neoclouds obviously are really targeted. The infrastructure is purpose built for GPUs. The same can also be said about the scale. Obviously, hyperscalers are global, they're geographically distributed, they're huge scale, hugely implemented. When you compare that to neoclouds, they're often more regional. Sovereign AI data centers is a term often thrown around, and you can certainly see that within Europe. Obviously, again, you've got exceptions to the case when you look at CoreWeave or others who are actually geographically distributed, have kind of global capacity. The other kind of major factor that I would say kind of differentiates them from hyperscalers is around pricing and the simplicity to which GPUs can be provisioned in the pricing structure. It's very much on simplicity, predictability, GPUs per hour, per user, per database. All of these factors come into the pricing strategy. Other than that, I think in terms of where we're looking at the technology itself and the software ecosystem around the GPUs, neoclouds are really focusing on utilizing open source kind of software and the overall software stack, whereas hyperscalers are trying to build kind of barriers to exit by implementing and deploying proprietary solutions, services, managed offerings around their core infrastructure.
Yeah, Reece, and how significant is their presence in the AI market compared to traditional hyperscalers?
So there's still very much challenges. The majority of neocloud providers have been very much at the forefront of the market for, let's say, 3 or 4 years. That would be kind of the longer lead time ones. And they're very much challenges. They are regionally specific in the most part. They're often very heavily focused on specific segments of the market, if that's AI R&D, if that's AI vendors. They're not particularly focused on the enterprise space at the moment. Again, some exceptions out there, but hyperscalers really, given their breadth of service offering, given their breadth of capabilities, including storage, CPUs, all of the different areas, they have a real hold on the enterprise market. Enterprises kind of the reason neoclouds, although they offer sometimes much better pricing in terms of GPU capacity, sometimes much better time to market for a new GPU, new service offering, enterprises are very much constrained within the hyperscalers. That's not only because of the ecosystem around that, but it's about the pricing and around the egress fees, the ingress fees, all of those different things really constraining a lot of the enterprise market towards the hyperscalers. The other major challenge I would say is around global scale. If you're an MNC operating across the globe, it's going to be very challenging to use neoclouds, deploy in different data centers. when you've already maybe got existing relationships, existing regulation and governance alignment with hyperscalers. All of those factors really are keeping neoclouds in a challenger position compared to the hyperscalers, which are the majority of the market share.
Yeah, and Reece, what's driving some enterprises and governments to consider these new clouds instead of, or maybe in addition to, major hyperscalers?
I would say, from my perspective, it's very much, with a few exceptions, in conjunction with. Obviously, you've got AI ISVs and vendors and model developers and R&D houses, which are putting a lot of their compute workloads into neoclouds. But when you look at the enterprise space, it's very much in conjunction. But what's really driving them at the
Okay.
moment is the big issue within the AI market, and that's cost. Neoclouds have much lower, and there's a much lower cost per hour basis for GPU capacity, which is obviously, when you're training models or even running inference, that's a huge advantage. I think the transparency around sovereignty and cloud usage is another factor, especially in Europe, where the EU AI Act and industry-specific regulation is coming into how enterprises have to be deploying their workloads. Sovereignty and control are really big drivers towards the neocloud market. I think another factor which really is driving it is around power and infrastructure reliability. Obviously, hyperscalers have access to power capacity, but when we're looking at emerging regions, emerging opportunities, a lot of that power capacity is now filtering down to neoclouds. You can see in the Nordic regions, or you can see in Germany, where neoclouds are really hoovering up a lot of growing power capacity within the grid. And I think that's a major driver, because that feeds into stuff like reliability and longevity of services. And I think this is one of the major factors kind of impacting enterprise decision makers. And then the last one, I would say, maybe not so important for the enterprise market, but quick time to market for leading edge infrastructure is a really big drive for some R&D professionals who are training massive models. If you look at kind of the time to market for the likes of Crusoe to bring Grace Blackwell or Blackwell into production and into kind of operations, compared to AWS or others in the hyperscale domain, it's just much quicker, much easier for them, for those operating and building and developing models, to gain access to leading edge hardware.
Yeah, and you have already mentioned this, but from your perspective, Reece, what are the biggest challenges that new clouds face when they compete with large hyperscalers?
I think, from my perspective, I think the one major challenge is around the hyperscaler lock-in. And if you look at the enterprise space and brownfield workloads and deployments, moving them from a hyperscaler domain into a neo cloud or an alternative cloud provider is, one, very costly, operationally challenging, often regulatory constrained. That's a major challenge. I think scale could come into it when you talk about MNCs and deploying at a global perspective. That could be a major factor. But I also do think that one challenge that neoclouds are going to have to solve is around applications and that service ecosystem. If you look at a hyperscaler and their breadth of offerings, they're able to support enterprises across their entire ecosystem, and they're able to provide storage solutions or CPU solutions. Neoclouds are really constrained at the moment, in the most part, to AI workloads. And although that's a massive growing greenfield workload, if they want to start taking share away from hyperscalers in the brownfield operations, I think that's an area they need to explore. And the likes of kind of Scaleway in Europe or some of the US players are really investing in the managed service ecosystem, MLOps layer, networking, all of these different domains. But at the moment, it's very immature compared to where the hyperscalers are.
Reece, yeah, and how do issues like data sovereignty, AI regulations, and regional industrial policies are shaping opportunities for neoclouds in Europe, Asia, or other regions?
So very much on the kind of the news at the moment, and looking at kind of Europe, we've obviously got the EU AI Act, you've got industry specific regulation coming into play. These are kind of one of the, I wouldn't say the major driver towards the neocloud market, but when we're looking at neoclouds building out their infrastructure, they're able to provide a different level of service compared to hyperscalers. So it is going to drive customer demand to those locations. I think that's going to be a short to medium term factor in determining neoclouds and driving enterprises towards those workloads, towards those domains. Asia is another very interesting domain where sovereignty dynamics, regulation is still very early days, and it's still yet to be determined how that actually influences enterprise decision makers. I was recently speaking to a neocloud who is views that one of their key USPs as ability to shape and support data and AI sovereignty within the regions that it operates. And one of the growth regions for that measure is Asia. Another is the Middle East. North America, not so much. But I do think it will start to be a factor in the short to medium term in terms of how enterprises start to operate within neoclouds.
Reece, final question. Looking 5 years ahead, do you think that these companies, Neoclouds, will capture a meaningful share of the AI cloud market, or you think they will remain like niche providers and will serve specific segments?
I think from my perspective, I think they will capture a meaningful share of AI greenfield workloads. I think there's a number of
Okay.
factors. I don't think it's going to be comparable to the hyperscalers. I think they will still dominate, but it will
Yeah.
be certainly a large force within the AI market. I think there are a couple of factors that will influence that. I think one major factor is around the edge, and increasingly we're seeing a huge amount of enterprise demand for edge data centers to run AI workloads in metropolitan regions or close to the end application. I think that's a huge opportunity for neoclouds to capture, and their business model of high VC funding, quicker kind of more agile strategy will enable to quickly buy up these locations or partner with co-location providers and start providing infrastructure right at the edge. I think that's a big opportunity for them. And if they capture that opportunity, or if they invest heavily there, they've got a huge opportunity to capture these greenfield workloads. I think another factor that plays into this will be how they build out and drive up
Yeah.
the stack. At the moment, you've seen a lot of activity around managed services and software and partnerships in the ecosystem, especially from some of these kind of growing neocloud providers. And I think the larger their ecosystems become and the more comparable you see them to hyperscalers will certainly influence how competitive they are for within the ecosystem. Another kind of factor that will likely to impact this market is around consolidation. At the moment, you've got about, let's say, 5 to 10 fairly large neocloud providers, Lambda, CoreWeave, etc., Scaleway in Europe, Nebius in Europe. But what
Yeah.
you also have is a huge amount of niche players within the middle and lower ends of the market, which at the moment, it's very unlikely that all of these players in 5 to 10 years will still exist. My expectation, and I think it resonates with the rest of the industry, is that there's going to be a huge amount of consolidation. And that could either be led
Mhm.
by the large neoclouds if they have the funding to go and kind of hoover up and buy these smaller players, or conversely, it could be led by the hyperscalers. They've got a massive amount of funding. They want to keep building out their infrastructure and keep building out AI specific infrastructure. So if they utilize that, start hoovering up these smaller niche neocloud providers, providing AI specific infrastructure, that could be a huge challenge for neocloud competitors. So I think there's a couple of different factors, but I think overall, the growth of AI workloads, especially greenfield AI workloads, especially inference greenfield AI workloads, will likely lead to neoclouds capturing a significant proportion of market share moving forward.
Well, that's really interesting. Reece, thank you very much again for your time today.
No problem. Yeah, great to speak to you.
And thank you all for watching. Please stay tuned for more conversations on this critical space. Thank you very much again.